Today we're going to take a look at the Brightin 28mm f2.8 Pancake lens. And full disclosure, Brightin sent this out to me to review, but as always I'll give you my honest and fair opinion. Now what struck me first about this lens, and this is subjective, but I think it's a beautiful lens and it makes any camera look very vintage. I mean, it's got this beautiful black lacquer painting on it with hand-painted lettering, and it's an all-metal, mostly brass construction. Now this lens is only available in the Leica M mount, so you'll need an adapter for your mirrorless camera, but of all the mounts that you can adapt to your camera, the M mount is probably the most preferable because it has the shortest flange distance, meaning the adapter itself is going to be very thin and it's not going to really add any bulk to your camera. Now in Micro Four Thirds, this is a 56mm equivalent. On APS-C it'd be 42mm, and then of course on full frame 28mm is 28mm. But on my favorite camera, the K&F at 56mm, is very close to my favorite focal length of 50mm. So I was very comfortable, composing at that focal length and getting the kind of shots that I like. But when I put this on my Sony full frame camera, I gotta tell you, it took me a while to get used to shooting at 28mm. I'm just not used to shooting this wide, but after about 2 or 3 weeks of shooting with this lens, I can tell you I'm really starting to like the 28mm focal length. Alright, now let's talk about some of the more objective things about this lens. It is a Pancake lens, of course. It is fully manual focus with a manual aperture ring here in the front, and it only comes in the Leica M mount. However, it is coupled to the Leica rangefinder so that when you are manually focusing, you'll get that split screen in the window. You just have to be conscious, not all Leica cameras have 28mm frame lines, but if you have a Leica, you probably know that. Also, the lens design is 6 elements and 5 groups, and it has a minimum focusing distance of 70 centimeters. So you're not going to do any close-up photography with this lens. Obviously, one of the compromises they had to make in making this so small, but it is very, very sharp in the center. We'll do some sharpness tests and brick wall tests here in a minute. The aperture blades has 9 rounded aperture blades, so I found the bokeh to be actually rather pleasing and smooth, not bad at all, but you don't really get any sun stars with this lens. Now a couple of weird things about this is, first is this aperture ring. It's very hard to see here, but you turn this with your finger, and this is hard enough to do with just your bare finger. It's nearly impossible if you're wearing gloves. So what I ended up doing is, you have to turn the camera around to face you, set the aperture. Using 2 fingers is a little bit easier. And I would set it to like f5.6 and the focus ring somewhere here in the middle. And for the most part, I was able to get most of my shots reasonably in focus. If I need a critical focus, I would just use the magnify function or focus peaking and dial that in as needed. The other weird thing about this lens is it does have a filter ring on it, but it's a weird size, very small, 25.5mm. And Brightin does sell the UV filter for it, which I have on here now. So it's very thin. You wouldn't know there's a UV filter on here. But that'll protect the front element because the lens cap is this tiny little metal screw-on thing as well. And I think I've already lost it. I don't know where it is. So after I put this UV filter on, I didn't worry about the little metal lens cap that came with it. All right, now let's talk about some of the optical properties of this lens, and we'll start with barrel distortion and vignetting. And this lens definitely does exhibit some that you'll have to correct for in post, particularly if you're doing any kind of architectural type photography. You will notice it. I had to dial in about 30% on my barrel distortion and about 50% on the vignetting, which is not as bad as it sounds, as you can see here. But on a crop sensor camera, you don't really have to dial in any vignetting, and then for barrel distortion on my Micro Four Thirds, I only had to dial in like 5%. Now when it comes to center sharpness on my Sony 60 megapixel camera, it's actually pretty sharp at f2.8. And then when we stop down to f4, it gets a lot sharper. And then at f5.6, I think this is where this lens is at its peak sharpness, which is really good. And then at f8 and f11, maybe we're kind of back to like f4 levels, but it's still very, very sharp. And then by f16, we're actually not doing too bad. We're back to about f2.8 levels. Now when it comes to corner sharpness, this is where we run into a problem, and it's partially due to the barrel distortion or field curvature of the focus plane. And it's pretty rough in the very edges of the frame. It gets a little better as you stop down, but it really doesn't improve until you get all the way to f16, which tells me that it's mostly because of the field curvature at the edges of the frame. Now that said, the softness didn't really occur until almost the edges of the frame. And usually when you're shooting such wide angle, things at the edge of the frame are on a different focal plane and they're going to be out of focus anyway. The only time you're really going to notice if you're filling the frame with, say, architectural or doing art reproduction. In that case, this is not the lens for you. But for most photography, the things that I was shooting, I didn't even notice it until I shot this brick wall. And if you're shooting on a crop sensor camera, especially micro four thirds, just like the vignetting and barrels distortion, you're not going to see that at all. Now for astrophotography at f2.8 and f4, I didn't really notice that much coma. But you still do have to watch out for the corner softness when you're shooting on a full frame camera. And then the last thing I'll talk about is flaring. And as with most wide angle lenses, if you point it directly at a strong light source like the sun, you're going to get some flaring. And it's not terrible on this lens, but it is there. And I think it adds character to the lens, and you have to learn how to use it creatively if you're going to do shots like this. And I did several shots where I shot directly into the sun for that dramatic effect. So this lens is not optically perfect, but to be honest, I still really love this lens because it just has a certain character to it. It's got this vintage look that is really hard to find today in modern lenses. You know, lenses today are so clinical, they're just so sharp. But when I'm just out to enjoy my photography, this lens really strikes a lot of different chords. You know, like all of the defects that we've talked about up to this point just add a certain amount of character to your images. And the build quality and the craftsmanship that went into making this lens, I think really shows when you hold it in your hands and when you adjust the focusing ring, not the aperture ring, but the focusing ring. So if you're looking for a lens that'll give your photography a little bit of style, either aesthetically on your camera or some character in your images, this is the lens for you. And I'll have my links down below. You can check out the current pricing. I think it's under $400 right now. Its price has just been fluctuating lately, so you'll have to see what it's going for now. But that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed this review. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.